Most contractors fail assessments, not because the controls are unimplemented, but because the assessor couldn't confirm they were. A control with no evidence is a finding. A policy that exists but isn't followed is a finding. A configuration that works in production but can't be demonstrated is a finding. The assessment is not a paperwork audit, and it is not a penetration test. It is a structured verification process, and if you don't understand how it works, you are not ready for it. This is the CMMC Advisor. This video is for IT managers, security managers, compliance leads, and consultants preparing for a CMMC Level 2 assessment, or preparing a client for one. Here is the core question. When a C3PAO assessor, that is, a CMMC third-party assessment organization, walks into your environment, what are they actually doing? What do they look at? How do they evaluate what they see? And what is the difference between a practice that passes and a practice that generates a finding? That is exactly what we are going to break down. CMMC Level 2 certification is required to handle Controlled Unclassified Information, CUI, under most DoD contracts that invoke DFARS 252.204-7012. The assessment is conducted by a licensed C3PAO and evaluated against 110 practices derived from MIS Special Publication 800-171. The stakes are straightforward. If your assessment results in findings that cannot be closed, you do not receive a CMMC Level 2 certification. Without that certification, you cannot perform or compete for contracts requiring it. And here is what many contractors underestimate. A single unresolved finding in a critical control can block certification even if 109 other practices are fully implemented. There is no partial credit in the sense that matters most. The SPRS score, that is your Supplier Performance Risk System score, reflects where you are. But the certification decision is binary. So the question is not just whether you have implemented the controls. The question is whether you can prove it to a trained assessor using methods they will accept within the time frame of the assessment. That distinction is where most contractors get into trouble. Let's get into how an assessment actually works. The CMMC assessment process, known as the CAP, defines 3 assessment methods: examine, interview, and test. Every practice is assessed through one or more of these methods. Understanding them is essential. Examine means the assessor reviews documentation. This includes your system security plan, the SSP, your policies, procedures, configuration baselines, network diagrams, asset inventories, audit logs, training records, and any other artifacts relevant to the practice being evaluated. The assessor is asking, does this documentation exist? Is it current? And does it reflect what is actually in place? Interview means the assessor speaks with personnel, your system administrators, security staff, and sometimes end users. They are not trying to trip people up. They are verifying that the people responsible for implementing and maintaining controls understand what they are doing and why. Inconsistency between what your documentation says and what your staff describes is a significant red flag. Test means the assessor observes or interacts with the system directly. This can include reviewing firewall rule sets, observing multi-factor authentication in practice, pulling audit log samples, inspecting configuration settings on endpoints or servers, or reviewing access control lists. Test activities confirm that controls are not just documented, they are operational. Now, here is how these methods map to findings. For each of the 110 practices, the assessor determines whether it is met or not met. A practice is met when the evidence across examine, interview, and test is sufficient and consistent. A practice is not met when evidence is missing, contradictory, or does not demonstrate that the requirement is fully implemented. Not met findings are documented in the assessment report. Some findings may be eligible for a plan of action, a POA&M, depending on their nature and the current CMMC rulemaking guidance. But not all findings can be deferred. Practices in certain control families may require immediate remediation before certification is granted. Let's talk about control families specifically, because assessors do not walk in treating all 110 practices equally. Highly scrutinized areas typically include access control, AC, audit and accountability, AU, configuration management, CM, identification and authentication, IA, and system and communications protection, SC. These families tend to generate the most findings because they require both technical implementation and operational evidence. It is not enough to have an MFA policy. Your AU logs need to show authentication events. Your IA configurations need to enforce MFA consistently. And your staff need to be able to describe how exceptions are handled. The assessor is building a coherent picture across all three methods. If one method produces an inconsistency, it calls the others into question. Here are the specific mistakes that turn implemented controls into findings. First, the SSP describes a future state, not the current state. This is extremely common. Contractors build an SSP to plan their implementation, and then they start the assessment without updating it to reflect what is actually deployed. The assessor examines the SSP and then tests the system, and the two do not match. That inconsistency is a finding, even if the technical implementation is correct. Your SSP must describe what is in place right now, not what you intend to build. Second, evidence is assembled for the assessment but does not reflect normal operations. Assessors can tell when audit logs were activated the week before the assessment. They can tell when configuration baselines were written but never enforced. They will ask questions like, when was this policy last reviewed? Who approved this configuration change? Show me a recent log sample. If your evidence only exists for the assessment, it will not hold up under interview and test scrutiny. Third, interview inconsistency. Your documentation says one thing, and your system administrator describes a different process. This happens when staff are not briefed on what is in the SSP and the policies, or when the policies were written by a consultant and the technical team was never involved. Assessors treat interview inconsistency as a reliability signal. One inconsistency raises questions about all your evidence. Fourth, scope confusion. Contractors sometimes believe that if a system is not in scope for CMMC, they do not need to demonstrate its controls. But if that out-of-scope system has network connectivity to CUI-bearing systems, and it is not properly isolated and documented, the assessor may expand scope. Your network architecture documentation and your asset inventory need to clearly define the assessment boundary, and the boundary needs to be defensible. Fifth, treating POA&Ms as a free pass. A POA&M documents a planned remediation for a finding. It does not eliminate the finding. Contractors sometimes over-rely on POA&Ms as a way to defer work, and then discover that certain findings are not deferrable, or that the aggregate of deferred findings prevents certification. Know which controls have zero tolerance for open findings before the assessment begins. Here are 6 concrete steps to take before your assessment. 1. Audit your SSP for current state accuracy. Go section by section and verify that every described control reflects what is actually implemented and operational today. Date stamp the review. This is not a one-time exercise. It should be updated anytime a relevant change is made to your environment. 2. Map your evidence artifacts to each of the 110 practices. For every practice, identify what documentary evidence exists, which personnel can speak to it in an interview, and how it can be demonstrated technically. If you cannot answer all 3 for a given practice, that is a gap. 3. Conduct internal evidence walkthroughs using the Examine, Interview, Test framework. Don't just review documents internally. Actually sit your system administrator down and walk through what an assessor would ask. Does their verbal description match the SSP? Can they pull the relevant logs on demand? 4. Validate your assessment boundary documentation. Your network diagram and asset inventory need to clearly define what is in scope, what is out of scope, and how CUI flows through your environment. Boundary ambiguity invites scope expansion. 5. Review your open POA&M items and classify them by criticality. Identify which findings are deferrable under current guidance and which are not. Close or remediate any practice that cannot be deferred before the formal assessment begins. 6. Brief all personnel who may be interviewed. This does not mean coaching them to give scripted answers. It means making sure the people responsible for your controls have read the relevant SSP sections and understand what is implemented and why. Interviewed staff should be accurate and consistent, not rehearsed. The CMMC assessment is a structured verification process. The assessor is not looking for perfection. They are looking for evidence that your controls are real, operational, and consistently maintained. If you want the CMMC Level 2 Assessment Evidence Guide, a control family by control family reference that maps each of the 110 practices to the artifacts assessors commonly request, drop evidence in the comments, and we will send it your way. The link is also in the description. Either way works. Evidence in the comments. One important note: CMMC requirements and assessment procedures continue to evolve. Verify all specifics against current guidance from the Department of Defense and the CMMC accredited body before you act on anything discussed here. Know what the assessor is looking for before they walk in the door. That preparation is not gaming the system. It is doing the work correctly.